If you are hearing these words and something inside you feels strangely calm, curious, or deeply attentive, then something important has already happened. Awakening does not begin with fireworks or dramatic visions. As Alan Watts often explained, it begins quietly, almost invisibly, with a subtle shift in awareness. You start to sense that the way you were taught to see the world is incomplete. Not wrong, but incomplete. And that realization alone is the first doorway. Most people live their entire lives inside mental noise. Endless thinking, constant comparison, chasing approval, fearing loss, and repeating inherited beliefs without questioning them. Awakening begins the moment this noise starts to feel exhausting rather than normal. You may notice that conversations no longer satisfy you the way they once did. Entertainment feels hollow. Achievements that once motivated you now feel strangely empty. This is not depression. This is awareness waking up to itself. Alan Watts described this moment as realizing that you are not the thoughts in your head, but the one who is aware of them. When that recognition dawns, even faintly, life can never fully return to what it was. You may still participate in society, work, relationships, and responsibilities, but inwardly something has shifted. You are no longer completely hypnotized by the story of me that the mind constantly repeats. This is why hearing a message like this resonates with you. It is not giving you new information. It is reminding you of something you already know but may have forgotten. Truth does not convince. It recognizes. When a message aligns with your inner knowing, it feels less like learning and more like remembering. At this stage, awakening often feels confusing. You may not have language for what you are experiencing. You only know that something feels different. You observe your reactions more closely. You catch yourself before emotional spirals. You notice how much of human behavior is driven by fear and conditioning. This observation does not make you superior. In fact, it often makes you more humble because you begin to see how deeply you were once asleep as well. Alan Watts emphasized that awakening is not about becoming someone special. It is about seeing that the sense of being a separate, isolated self was an illusion all along. The world does not happen to you. You are an expression of it. When this insight starts to emerge, even intellectually, it creates a quiet but irreversible transformation. If you are hearing this and feeling an inner stillness rather than excitement, that is a sign of authenticity. Awakening does not shout. It whispers, it invites. It does not demand belief, only attention. And the fact that you are listening means you have already stepped beyond the threshold, whether you fully realize it yet or not. As awakening deepens, one of the first noticeable changes is your relationship with identity. Alan Watts often pointed out that most human suffering comes from confusing who we are with what we think we are. Names, roles, labels, histories, beliefs, and achievements form a mental mask that society encourages us to protect at all costs. When awakening begins, that mask starts to feel heavy, restrictive, even artificial. You may notice that you no longer feel the same need to define yourself. Questions like, who am I supposed to be? Or how do others see me? Lose their urgency. This can be unsettling at first. The ego thrives on certainty, and when its familiar structures begin to dissolve, it reacts with fear. You might experience moments of anxiety, emptiness, or disorientation, not because something is wrong, but because something false is falling away. Alan Watts described this phase as realizing that the self you've been defending is more like a story than a solid entity. Thoughts appear, emotions arise, memories surface, but none of them stay. And yet, something remains aware through all of it. That awareness does not need protection. It does not need validation. It simply is. During this stage, you may feel increasingly detached from social performance. Small talk can feel draining. Competition may seem pointless. The constant need to appear successful, confident, or important begins to feel like a game you no longer want to play. This does not mean you reject life. It means you stop pretending for it. You may also become more sensitive to inner dishonesty. Situations where you once stayed silent to maintain comfort now feel unbearable. Living out of alignment with your inner truth creates immediate tension. This is not moral superiority, it is clarity. Awakening sharpens perception, and with sharper perception comes an inability to ignore what feels false. Alan Watts emphasized that this stage is not about rejecting the world but seeing through it. You still participate, but you no longer confuse the roles you play with who you are. Just as an actor does not forget they are acting, you begin to move through life with a lightness that comes from not being psychologically trapped by your own identity. This is also when you may feel alone, even around others. Not because you are disconnected, but because your way of perceiving has changed. Many people are still deeply identified with their thoughts and roles, and conversations revolve around reinforcing those identities. When you are no longer fully invested in that reinforcement, a quiet distance naturally appears, yet beneath that distance is a deeper sense of peace. You are no longer constantly defending an image. You are no longer fighting to prove your worth. You begin to rest in the simple experience of being aware. And as Alan Watts reminded, this awareness is not something you achieve. It is what you have always been, finally noticing itself. As awakening continues, your relationship with fear, desire, and time begins to shift in profound ways. Alan Watts often spoke about how much of human anxiety comes from living psychologically in the future or the past. The awakened awareness starts to loosen this grip. You may notice that fear no longer feels as solid or permanent as it once did. It still arises, but it passes through you rather than defining you. This happens because you begin to see fear as a sensation and a thought pattern, not as a command. Fear loses its authority when it is observed. Instead of asking, how do I get rid of this feeling? The mind naturally shifts to, what is this feeling made of? And in that moment of observation, fear starts to dissolve on its own. Desire undergoes a similar transformation. Before awakening, desire often feels urgent and compulsory. You believe that happiness lies just beyond the next achievement, possession, or recognition. Awakening reveals the subtle tension hidden inside this constant wanting. You realize that desire itself is not the problem, but unconscious attachment to outcomes is. Alan Watts described this as mistaking the menu for the meal. We chase symbols of fulfillment while ignoring the experience of being alive right now. As this clarity deepens, desires become lighter. You may still pursue goals, but without the belief that your worth or peace depends on their outcome. Success feels enjoyable rather than necessary. Failure feels instructive rather than crushing. Life becomes less about control and more about participation. Time, too, begins to change its texture. You may notice moments when the sense of rushing disappears. The past loses its emotional charge, and the future loses its threatening grip. This does not mean you forget responsibilities or plans. It means you no longer live inside them psychologically. Alan Watts referred to this as returning to the eternal now, not as a mystical escape, but as the only place life actually happens. In this stage, silence becomes more meaningful. Not external silence, but inner quiet. The constant mental commentary softens. You may find yourself enjoying ordinary moments with unusual depth. Walking, breathing, listening, or simply sitting becomes enough. There is a subtle joy in simplicity that cannot be explained, only experienced. Paradoxically, this is also when uncertainty becomes easier to tolerate. You no longer need all the answers. Not knowing stops feeling like a failure and starts feeling like freedom. Life becomes a mystery you are participating in rather than a problem you must solve. Alan Watts emphasized that awakening is not about escaping fear, desire, or time, but seeing their true nature. They are movements within awareness, not threats to it. When this is realized, existence feels less like a struggle and more like a dance. You still move, choose, and act, but with a sense of flow rather than resistance. At this stage, you may realize that peace is not something added to life. It is what remains when you stop resisting life. And once this is seen, it cannot be unseen. As awakening matures, something subtle but decisive occurs. The search itself begins to fall away. For a long time, you may have felt as though you were moving toward awakening, studying it, listening to it, chasing moments of insight or clarity. But now, a quiet recognition emerges. There was never a destination. The seeker and what was being sought were never separate. Alan Watts often emphasized that the greatest illusion is the belief that enlightenment is an achievement. When this illusion dissolves, there is a deep relaxation. You stop trying to become something different. You stop measuring your spiritual progress. Life no longer feels like a ladder you must climb, but a landscape you are already standing in. This stage does not look dramatic from the outside. In fact, it can appear very ordinary. You still wake up, work, interact, and face challenges. But inwardly, your relationship with experience has changed. You are no longer psychologically fighting what is happening. Emotions arise and pass. Thoughts come and go. Success and failure move through you without defining you. One of the clearest signs of this phase is simplicity. There is less mental noise, less inner conflict, and less need to explain yourself to others. You may find that you speak less, but when you do speak, your words carry clarity. Silence becomes comfortable rather than awkward. Presence replaces performance. Compassion also deepens naturally, not as a moral effort, but as understanding. When you see how deeply others are identified with their thoughts, fears, and roles, judgment loses its grip. You recognize the same confusion you once lived in. This does not mean you tolerate harm or dishonesty, but you no longer personalize behavior. You see people acting from conditioning, just as you once did. Alan Watts described this as realizing that life is not happening to you, but through you. The sense of being a separate individual struggling against the universe softens. You begin to feel like an expression of the same process that moves the wind, grows the trees, and turns the stars. This understanding is not conceptual, it is felt. At this stage, spiritual language itself may lose importance. Words like awakening, enlightenment, or consciousness begin to feel unnecessary. You may even stop seeking spiritual content altogether, not because you reject it, but because you no longer need it to confirm what is already obvious in experience. And yet, there is humility here. No sense of superiority, no claim of arrival, just a quiet gratitude for being alive. You begin to trust life more even when it is uncomfortable. You understand that uncertainty is not a mistake. It is the nature of existence. In the end, awakening does not turn you into someone special. It returns you to what you were before you tried to become anything at all. As Alan Watts so often reminded, the universe is not asking you to wake up. It is already awake, and it is playing at being you.